Right, good morning. It's lovely to be here. What a lovely venue. I think we've got good weather. And we're set fair for today. And actually, I believe we're set fair for the future of SEN. There's a big, bold statement to start the day with. It's a really important time, and it's good that so many people are here today. I think many of us are slightly anxious about what's coming, aren't we? But there's no need to be. Most people are doing a good job in SEN, and what we're proposing for the future is really building on good practice. So where you've been doing a good job, I think you're going to sail smoothly and beautifully into the new world of special educational needs. What I want to do, though, is to give you the absolute up-to-date information on what the new future looks like, why we are where we are today, and how we're going to get to a better position for special educational needs. Some of us, probably many people in this room, have devoted most of their working lives to children with special educational needs. Some of us for longer than others, and some of us will remember a time, probably not that many of us in the room, a time when children with special educational needs were pretty much invisible in the system. The 1981 Education Act really radically transformed the educational lives of the most vulnerable children in our society, those with really very complex special educational needs and disability. And the creation then of a statutory framework to protect their education, to identify exactly how education could support their needs, was a very powerful move forward. It took time to evolve. We didn't quite know how to do the job well then, and schools were understandably quite nervous about the new challenges at that time. But we had plenty of time, and over a period of time, we have learned to accommodate the needs of an increasingly diverse range of our population. We've had adjustments to the statutory framework. The 1996 Education Act, which really is the foundations and the basic framework for what you're all doing, made some changes. But in essence, there was very little substantial change to what we introduced in 1981. Before 1981, children with special educational needs really didn't have any decent educational opportunities. And in fact, those of us who went to school before the 1981 Education Act will remember that really we didn't meet children with very complex needs. They were very much invisible. They were somewhere else, but they weren't in our schools. And they weren't having the equal opportunity to a good education that other young people were having. The 81 Act transformed that. I also remember when I was growing up, and I used to go to the equivalent of McDonald's in those days, I never met children with complex needs. Now you go to the McDonald's of today, and I'm not sort of advocating on behalf of McDonald's, just using it as an analogy of our society, but you go to places like McDonald's, and one meets children with complex needs all the time. Society has changed, and I believe that that's because we in education have faced the challenge of addressing the needs of a population who we didn't really know before 1981, who we really didn't have any need to know. We weren't being told we have to do something for these young people. And I think we've grown together as an education system to be much more confident about understanding the needs of our most complex youngsters. We've grown more confident, we've understood how they develop, and we've recognized that it's not quite so scary after all to try and work out how to support them. So it's taken time, though. I was with a group a couple of years ago when we were debating all the changes in the system. This was a group in a very large local authority of parents of children with Down syndrome. And they were having a little bit of a moan that that only 2/3 of children with Down syndrome in that local authority were being educated in mainstream schools. That's 2 years ago. So 1/3 were not being educated in mainstream schools, and they were unhappy about that. Now, one can sympathize with their position on the 1/3, but actually I have to say that back in 1981, that would have been a 0%. By the end of the 80s, it might have been 4 or 5 or 6 or 7%, something small. And over time, we have grown much more confident about working with the population of children with Down syndrome and with every other type of special educational need. Now, they see a journey still to go, and so do we. There is still a journey to go to make sure that all of our children have an equal opportunity to a good education, and even more importantly, that they get good, meaningful outcomes from the system. I'm going to just stop there and say to Tim, you know that watch you gave me so that I could monitor my time? I seem to have arrived here without it, so I must have left it over there or somewhere else. So I haven't got anything to monitor my time, and Tim, you've lost your watch so far, for which I deeply apologize. Oh, I think it's on the way. Thank you. I might as well say, you go to venues, and I know Tim splashed out a fortune on this one, but they don't provide a clock for your speakers to keep to time. And if your speakers don't wear watches, they have to turn to the head of service for one. Okay, thank you. So we are changing the system. What I do think the 1981 Education Act has done fantastically well is promote the interests and improve the education experience of the individual child or young person. What has been absent, I think, has been a true integration and inclusion of the wider family context and the contribution from families to us understanding their challenges and their needs, and to integrate that more cohesively and in more meaningful and visible ways. And that's one of the things that our reformed agenda is aiming to do. So I'm really pleased that we've got parent-carer representatives here today. The other thing that it didn't go far enough on, the old system, the current system, is the sort of integration of the young person's needs as a whole, and therefore greater compunction upon all of the agencies to contribute to their development, to their provision, to service organisation. So those are two big areas, parents and a holistic multi-agency approach to our young people that we think needs improving. So what are we planning to do? Well, what we've got a number of reforms, and we want to see these in as outcomes. And I'm hoping that when you invite me back in 3 or 4 years to talk about your progress, that you'll be able to, we'll have a show of hands, and people will by and large say, yes, that has got better. So as I go through each of these, I'll be hoping that in 3 or 4 years, we'll get a show of hands saying, yes, these are better. So SEN picked up early, support routinely put in place. Well, that's not new, is it? That's part of the children's agenda for the last 10 years. And the SEN reforms continue with that thrust to try to make sure that people working on the front line are better skilled, better resourced, better able to identify needs and put resources and support routinely in place. That's one of the thinkings behind the standardization of the SEN funding system and the high needs system, to try to make sure there is a common system across the country so that schools across the country have a similar understanding of how resources are devolved, how much they have, and how they are to be used, etc. So that's really a very critical outcome. Secondly, and probably most importantly, we need to recognize that it's what people do every day that makes the most difference. What people do in the classroom, in the playground, and around that system that makes the most difference to whether young people get good outcomes from the system, whether they make progress, whether they're happy. So we need to make sure that we continue to approach the development, the knowledge, the understanding, the skills, and the attitudes of our staff and try to enhance that. So again, elements of the reforms are designed to make sure that, that we continue to provide those opportunities right across the board, whether it's from school-to-school support, local authorities support systems, nationally, etc. We need to keep our eye on workforce development. Parents struggle at times to understand what they're entitled to, what's available, how they can access it. And again, we want to make sure that provision from everyone involved in children's support services is very clear. And that's where the local offer, about which I'm sure you know quite a lot, and by the end of today we'll know even more, that's where that will play a critical role. We need to raise aspirations. Our outcomes for children with SEN and disability, although they have got better over the last 10 years, they haven't progressed at a sufficient rate. So the difference between the outcomes for children with SEN and those without SEN is still very, very significant. We haven't closed that gap at all. And we need to continue to seek ways of improving the outcomes for these young people. On SATs, GCSEs, etc., they do significantly less well. So we need to make sure that that improves. NEETs, not in education, employment, or training, some would say that that's the holy grail of the system. That's what we should all be striving towards improvement on. Children with SEN are much more likely to leave the school system, not in education, employment, or training. And we need to make sure that that gap is closed. But equally, on a wider front than progression and academic attainment, we're also concerned that children with SEN are something like 8 times more likely to be permanently excluded by a school than a child without SEN. They're 8 times more likely to be bullied. These are not statistics that are healthy, and when we say that a child with SEN is one of our most vulnerable, and then we find that they're bullied or excluded and so on, it doesn't make sense. It's something we need to significantly work at. So, and when you talk to children and families with complex needs, their dreams, hopes, aspirations are no different from any other family and young person. They want to achieve the same things in life. They have challenges in getting there, but what we need to do is drive our system to take those dreams, aspirations, and hopes and do more to move towards those and support that. And that's another thing that underlies much of the reforms. We talked 3 years ago about changing the statutory assessment system for the most complex needs to make sure it's a much more coordinated system, and that we have something that takes the place of a statement that reflects a much more holistic view of the young person and integrates all the 3 statutory agencies. So I'll say more about that shortly. And also, generally in public services in this country, we've got a much greater thrust to have greater control for users of services. So in adult social care, in adult health, and so on, people who use services have a much greater opportunity to influence those services, both in the ways that they are provided and also in the way that they engage in feedback and try to support service improvement. And we want to see how we can do that within the education system and in special educational needs. So what I want to do is go through the Children and Families Act. It is now an act. It's been through Parliament. It's had incredibly lengthy debate. The bill that preceded this has got more in it than special educational needs. It covers areas like adoption and fostering, the role of the Children's Commissioner, parental leave, etc. But the overwhelming majority of it in length is the SEN reforms. And in terms of parliamentary debating time, it took up about 90 to 95% of debate in Parliament. It was passed earlier this year. It's being enacted in September. It is the foundation of the new SEN system. So the Children and Families Act is where you will find the key areas. And what I want to do is really just go through some of the highlights that I think are really critical to understand for today's audience. And what we are aiming to do is to make sure that we change the culture. We want to make sure that we're always welcoming children, young people and their parents into the system, both at an individual level where they have their own challenges and difficulties, and we want to make sure that we do everything we can to listen to families, to try to take on board their wishes, and to personalize their programs of learning and support in meaningful ways. We also want to make sure that at a wider level across the system and across schools, that parents are much more engaged in dialogue about wider developments. So policy developments at local authority level, trying to inform provision development, and so on. And also providing feedback on how well we're all doing. So we're trying to create a different way of relating with our families. Now, we've tried to legislate for that in some ways, but this is about our hearts and minds, isn't it? It's about culture change, it's about what we do on a day-to-day basis, how we talk to people, how we try to think about involving them. That's why it's good that we've got families represented here today in what is largely a school conference, but it's critical we increasingly use opportunities to draw in parents so that we can hear their perspective and they can hear ours. Sharing is really very important, being open and transparent. Changing that culture is a key thrust of the legislation. Just a quick point on the difference between children and young people, because that term does differ from one agency to another. In schools, you can be a young person. Often secondary schools refer to 12, 13, 14-year-olds as young people. In the laws I'm talking about, you're a child until you're of statutory leaving age, which is 16 still, and you're a young person from statutory leaving age of 16 up to 25. It is important for those of you working with that older population to be aware of that difference, because it does confer different and new rights for young people. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but they have legal rights that they've never had before. So that's a really important highlight of the reforms, the engagement of families. It's also really important, we've got over the last 4 or 5 years, haven't we, we've seen quite a revolution in our landscape of educational provision. We've got so many different types of settings now. But what the SEN laws do, they apply to virtually every publicly funded educational establishment. So whether you're a maintained school, an academy, a free school, you must follow every aspect of the new requirements. There is no difference in anything on the SEN reforms, whether you're a maintained school, etc., etc. So, and although most academies, their individual funding agreement requires them to follow the 96 Act and the current Code of Practice, what this does is it obviates the need for it to be in an individual funding agreement related to a school, and it's simply the primary legislation that every school and so on must follow. So I think that's been very reassuring to families to know that the welcome they will get and the type of provision they can expect will be similar regardless of the background of the school. We talked about a coordinated assessment process early on. The current system is a very mechanical one. It's very clunky, it's very rigid, and it's very legally driven. What we've tried to do is create a much warmer system that's got less statutory rigor in it, although inevitably it's got a lot left in it because it is still a legal process. But we've tried to make sure that there are some key issues that come out of it. And I'll just go through some of the key things. We want to see assessment for the most complex to be an ongoing process, subject to change as needs change, and so on. We want it to be person-centered, and again, I think you're going to hear a lot more about person-centered planning approaches during the day today, but making sure that the child, the young person, the family are at the heart of the way we relate to them, the way we communicate, the way we interact, the way we run meetings, and so on. So we want these to be person-centered and to focus on the good aspects of development. And that's going to be true both for the initial assessment process and for all statutory reviews. And any other reviews ought to be driven by a much more person-centered approach. We want to try and minimize the amount of time that families have to tell their story. One of our groups of local authorities have been working with us on developments, came up with this notion of a tell-us-once approach. Very hard to achieve, very aspirational. It sets the right direction. And we can do that through parents communicating more effectively, through better IT solutions to information sharing, through the willingness of professionals to share information as well. We want families to be much more involved in decision-making, and what we're seeing in local authorities who've been trialling the new assessment process is that families are engaged in drawing it up collaboratively and co-producing the new education, health and care plan along the way of assessment. So it's an evolutionary approach, and parents do feel much more involved and understand how decisions are being made. Effective coordination between education, health and social care, well, again, that's not new. That's been part of the children's agenda for the last 10 years, and we know there's a long way to go still. This is another step in that journey towards improving that. And when you meet all the agencies, there's none of them that don't believe that in their hearts and aspire to it. There are just so many challenges. But we have introduced a couple of laws about which I will say more shortly, which will help move that journey on at a more rapid pace than we've seen, perhaps. We need our practitioners to be involved in the single assessment planning. We need them to see them committed. Some of the pathfinders that local authorities who've been working with us and trialling have found that it's often the practitioners who find it difficult to move away from well-established ways of assessing young people, communicating their information, talking to parents. And we need to see some changes there in well-established old practices. Key working approaches. Families do value having a single point of contact to support them through a very challenging process. Although we're trying to make the system much less legalistic and much more supportive, it is still a legal system, and therefore it brings with it its own complexity. So we're looking to local authorities in the assessment process to try to provide something which can be called a key worker, a single point of contact, an assessment coordinator who works more directly with families. Education, health and care plans, that new type of statement, we want it to be much more focused on outcomes, to think where the child wants to get to, what's possible, and how we actually take them on that journey together. And again, transition. And it's not just about the transition from school into the next stage of education, training, whatever, but there are many points in education of transition from nursery into school, primary to secondary, etc. We need to be forward-thinking more to help support. It's always a nervous time for every child moving from one establishment to another. But when you've got special educational needs, it is even more anxiety-provoking. So we need to find ways of supporting that better. And our plans need to be thinking ahead sooner than they currently are. The fourth highlight is about and these are the couple of laws that I think will bring health much more closely involved in the agenda. For the first time, we will now have a law that says health must work with the local authority to identify the needs of the population of children with SEN and disability and plan appropriate service provision. They will need to work jointly with the local authority to commission appropriate services. It's the first time that health have had a statutory duty to focus on that particular population, SEN and disability. That will make a difference. That will feed into the local offer, the services that will be provided locally, and over time will improve the quality and availability of services. The second duty that these laws introduce is that, unlike now in a statement where if you've got a health provision in Part 6, there's no obligation on health or anybody else to provide it. If a health provision is named in an education, health and care plan, then the local clinical commissioning group, health, must provide. That's a brand new law that will make a very significant difference. And of course, that's been welcomed across the SEN system. Local offer. I talked earlier about the lack of clarity about what's around, and we need to make sure that we are providing better quality information that responds to feedback from users about local provision. And actually, in most parts of an authority, there's quite a rich array of support around. But it's not always well known about, it's not always easy to find out about it, it's not easy to understand whether you're entitled to it and when you're entitled to it. So the local offer, some of the key features, there is a statutory requirement on a local authority to produce a local offer. There is a statutory requirement on a local authority to work with parents to co-produce it and with young people. So there is a law that says they must. There's a law that says, or there will be, that says the local authorities must fully involve services. Services is another word for schools and others, in its development and in its review. Schools are under a statutory obligation to cooperate with the local authority in producing the local offer. So when the local authority comes to you and says, we need to work together on this, we need information about this, that, and the other, schools can't say no. They must work with the local authority on developing the local offer and then in reviewing the local offer. We want it to be holistic. We're talking about the whole young person, preparing them for adulthood. So the information needs to be wider than education, needs to be wider than health and social care. It needs to include local facilities for transport, for preparing for employment, and so on. It is important to understand how to access services. It's often really very difficult to know whether your child fits the eligibility criteria for a particular service or how you will refer to that service. So service information needs to be much sharper. I said I'd say a bit more about the post-16 population. I do think this is an area about which the reforms will make a significant difference. The post-16 young people will have rights that they've never had. They've been subject to different laws. Some of you will be aware of learning difficulty assessments for young people leaving education but going on into FE with complex special educational needs. That's disappearing. They'll all be from 0 to 25 in one set of laws. And this provides advantages for young people above 16 that they've not had before. They'll be able to ask the local authority for a statutory assessment, and if it's not accepted, they have a right to appeal to the tribunal. They've never had rights to go to the tribunal about anything. They'll also be allowed to express a preference for provision. They've never been able to do that. They'll be allowed to express a preference for an FE college, which they've never been allowed to before. And if the local authority names an FE college in a plan, that college must admit. Colleges have never been told who to admit before. This is brand new stuff. It really will transform all sorts of issues around the post-16 provision. And finally, the offer of a personal budget. What this is about is trying to increase parental engagement in personalizing the program of support for their young people, for their children and young people. So families will be able to engage with the local authority in a dialogue about the cost of their provision, how it's organized, and have a much more personalized approach to service organization. I think when this was first talked about, there was a lot of anxiety that this would lead to parents being able to take large chunks of resources and purchase services left, right, and centre. Our work with Pathfinder shows that that's not really what's happening, that most services are locked into long-term arrangements for their provision, and it's very hard to withdraw resources and move it in a different direction. And what we've actually found is that very few families actually want to hold any purse strings. What they want is to have a much greater say in how the services are organized and how they're delivered, and sometimes when they're delivered. So having a much more personalized dialogue about the provision that's being made is what this is opening the opportunity for. We've got a new code of practice. There's one that's been published back in April. It's still on the website. It is pretty much what the final one will be. And it's not that different in terms of the messages and strategies that were in a previous version you will have seen back in October. If you treat the one that's out as the final one, you're not going to make any mistakes. There are a number of chapters there. The biggest chapter, the longest chapter, is on education, health and care plans, perhaps not surprising. The second biggest chapter is on schools. Perhaps not surprising. But it's a good read. Who must have regard to... someone wrote to me and said... it came out, they wrote to me and they said, Andre, this wasn't very easy bedtime reading. I said to them, well, it's your job. It's not meant to be your bedtime reading. Code of practice. Everyone, pretty much every publicly funded body in this country must have regard to the code of practice. What does having regard to it? Well, it means you must do what the code of practice says unless you've got a really good way of doing something differently. So if you were challenged, and it does happen occasionally, you would have to demonstrate that what you were doing was at least as good as what's recommended in the code of practice. So it's not surprising that pretty much everyone follows what's in the code of practice. So, pretty much everyone who's been having to follow the code of practice is going to have to follow the new code of practice. The only exceptions are really pretty much FE colleges and sixth form colleges. And again, those of you working with FE colleges and sixth form colleges, we need to understand that for the first time ever, they're being asked to follow a national statutory framework for identification of SEN and disability. This will provide some challenges. I generally believe that schools will sail easily into the new code of practice, partly because you've been used to having a code of practice, you understand what it means, and so on. Whereas for colleges, it's brand new territory, and I think we all need to be ready to provide support and guidance for colleges who don't quite understand the implications of that. So I just want to pull out some of the key features in relation to schools. And again, the old code of practice were written some time ago, and I do think that our approaches to teaching and learning, record keeping, target setting have evolved quite significantly over the past 10 to 15 years. We've got the thrust of quality first teaching, and what we need to do is what we've done is drawn the good practice in schools into the current code of practice. So the process of having quality first teaching, assess, planning, doing, and reviewing is embedded now in messages across the code. And really trying to locate lead responsibility for target setting, monitoring, and review with the class teacher, who by and large takes responsibility for the outcomes of every child in their class. The focus on regular conversations with parents is something we've tried to do before. It's reinforced now. The use of record keeping and monitoring of data. We don't mention IEPs in the new code. We've been trying to reduce the reliance on IEPs for some time, but they're not mentioned in the code. We believe that most schools these days have got very strong record-keeping, data management systems, and for all pupils. Why would we want to invent a separate system that's created its own industry and has led to lots of pieces of paper that very few people read and not necessarily have much impact on outcomes? So we're trying to encourage schools to take much greater ownership of data setting, of data management, and so on. We do think provision mapping is a useful management tool for having an oversight of all the young people that you're providing support for and tracking their progress in a sort of more holistic way. But at an individual level, we don't think there's a need for individual plans. What we are saying, of course, is that you must record things about that young person, but try and build it into your existing systems. The SEN information report, I'll say a bit more about that shortly. The role of SENCO, I'll say a bit more about that shortly. So SEN support, what we're doing is moving away from School Action and School Action Plus, and again, you'll be aware over the last 3 or 4 years of the debate around the utility of School Action and School Action Plus. We are removing that from the system and asking schools to identify those young people who need SEN support. And that will be those young people who require support that's beyond what's normally available within the classroom. So they need different and additional arrangements by and large. And what we're trying to do is put the onus on the class teacher to take the lead for identifying who those young people are and trying to plan support in conjunction with the SENCO. So the SENCO providing a more supportive role with class teachers rather than being the person who takes it all on. That's not to say there isn't a very important role for SENCOs in providing individual support. Of course there is. But we still want this class teacher to be playing a more active role in responsibility for all the children in their class. We've listed the roles and responsibilities of the SENCO. I'm not going to go through that list. There's nothing particularly new in it, but it's a reminder of some of the roles that SENCOs can and really should be fulfilling. The role of the SENCO is one that's defined by the governing body, and it's really very important to talk with them now at a changing time in SEN to reinforce the need for the SENCO to have a very strong and influential role in school development. The SEN information report, schools currently have a requirement to publish information. There are information regs at the moment. What we've done, we've tried to make this much simpler. This is a list of information that you must report upon statutorily and you must amend and update regularly. So again, that's spelt out in the chapter in the code, and there's also regulations if you want to read the actual detail, but the code would be enough for you to fulfill the requirements there. Just to point out that I mentioned bullying. We do want to see a reference to bullying in the information on SEN. Most of you will have anti-bullying or bullying policies. You'll probably reference bullying in your behavior policies. But because of the very strong research about the prevalence of bullying for the SEN population, we also want to see it referenced in SEN, just to provide reassurance to families and others that it is recognized as a particular issue for SEN, and that you are able to put actions in about that. We're clarifying transition arrangements. Moving from the current system of statements and so on is not easy. And we are about to publish in the next few days how the detail of moving from statements to education, health and care plans. In essence, we are expecting all statements to be converted to education, health and care plans. We're expecting local authorities to convert all statements within 3.5 years. That's a tall order for local authorities. Transforming the current statements will be a massive undertaking. So where you're asked for support from the local authority on that, to support particularly in reviews and planning, please support. It's a really challenging job for the local authority. The reforms go live in September. Some of the implications. The new code of practice applies to all educational provision. We reinforce the role of the SENCO. We're applying this new SEN support category. We want to put parents at the heart of the system. We want to make sure that they feel valued, engaged, and listened to. We need greater clarity about the school offer through the information requirements and through links with the local authority on the local offer. You're going to find a difference with education, health and care plans. They are different from statements. And if you take statements or education, health and care plans from more than just Gloucestershire, what you'll see is differences, because local authorities have got quite a lot of degree of freedom in how they present this information in the plans. And I've been looking at most authority proposed plans, and they are very different. So you'll find that slightly bewildering initially, and then you'll grow used to it, and it will be bread and butter. The basics are the same. And just finally, before I allow a few minutes for questions, actions that I think we need to be taking from a school or college perspective this side of Christmas. Need to agree the school contribution to the local offer with the local authority. So that's something I know that Gloucestershire is working very hard on. If there are opportunities to have head teacher reps or school reps on any newly evolving commissioning groups, latch onto those, say yes. It's an important time, isn't it, with national curriculum reform, assessment reform, now a way of approaching children with SEN. We need to integrate these as we as schools develop new policies and practices. So we need to review that, and it's an opportunity to involve parents. Remember, the national curriculum is reforming. Around 20% of our population have a special educational need. That's a fifth. That's a significant proportion who should be influencing the way you're moving in terms of new assessments, new curriculum arrangements, and so on. The move away from School Action Plus into SEN support, when does that have to be done by? Well, the first time, probably think of the January census, when you normally report on numbers of school action and types of need. Next January, there won't be School Action and School Action Plus, it will be SEN support. So that's probably your deadline for reviewing and making any adjustments. Need to publish the annual SEN information report. And for those of you working with older young people, it's really a very important time to strengthen relationships with post-16 providers. We want to have a seamless educational system for that population.